if they do this, this is their last war, because there aren't enough Russians under age 20 to theoretically repopulate the system. So when this is done one way or another, Russia is done. A battlefield defeat for the Russians isn't going to change anyone's mind. But if you break the Russian system, that would.
The president recently approved allowing Ukraine to use U.S.-provided weapons to fire across the Russian border.
What was happening up around Kharkiv, which was new just in the last couple of months, was a Russian offensive where they were moving from one side of the border directly to the other side of the border. And it simply didn't make sense not to allow the Ukrainians to fire across that border to hit Russian guns and emplacements that were firing at the Ukrainians. So the president authorized that. The Ukrainians have carried out that authorization on the battlefield. And one thing I will point out is that the momentum of that operation in Kharkiv has stalled out. And the United States will continue to support Ukraine in holding the line and pushing back against the aggressing Russian forces.
You need to look at the Patriot system not in terms of what's been going on for the last several months, but what's going to be going on for the next. So the last several months, obviously, the Ukrainians needed more air defense. The Russians were taking advantage of a lull in weapons deliveries, and obviously it would be relevant to get defense for that. But what's really coming up now is the imminent arrival of Western fighter jets, most notably the Mirages from France and the F-16s from the United States and its allies. If the Ukrainians can achieve, even just for brief moments, local air superiority, then the capacities of the Ukrainian military to launch offensives changes. Every offensive that the Ukrainians have attempted for the last 12 months has bogged down because they don't have air superiority. And if they can't maneuver functionally with armor and armored vehicles, then they can't move nearly as quickly, they can't move in large number, and it makes it a lot easier for Russian artillery to pick them apart. Well, if you can achieve, even just for a few hours, a certain blanket, then the tables turn and the Ukrainians can do things like clear mines without having to get shot at from artillery. You throw a Patriot into that, you throw the new F-16s into that, you combine that with a little bit more liberal restrictions on the Ukrainians' ability to target objects within Russia proper. And you're seeing the Ukrainians already starting to use things like the ATACMS to prep, say, Crimea by basically taking out something like an S-400 air defense system a day for the last week. And the Russians only have 50 of those for their entire country. We're changing the shape of the battlefield very quickly. You plug a Patriot into that process, and we can actually have perhaps a meaningful counteroffensive this summer. The S-400s have always been a bit of a mystery from the American and the NATO point of view, because until you're in a hot war, you have no idea how well the top-of-the-line equipment is going to work. Well, the S-400 is supposedly, pre-war, the most sophisticated anti-missile and anti-aircraft weapon system on the planet, much better supposedly than what the Americans could do. And now we discover it can't deal with rockets. Not only is this taking the Russians down several pegs in terms of their own feeling of their invulnerability, not only is it reducing the interest of countries like India in getting any weapon systems from the Russians, because now they realize they're not all that, it's changing the complexion of what is possible. Because if you can basically in one spot bleed the entire Russian air defense grid, then you're not just talking about a change in the Ukraine war, you're talking about a change in what Russia is capable of. And we're still kind of coming to grips with what that means. This is also new. Even if you don't conquer, reconquer, liberate, whatever word you want to use, Crimea, its military supply basically goes on two routes. There's a rail route that is on the mainland that goes through Mariupol, which is somewhat vulnerable to Ukrainian assault today. And that's the new line, that's the backup line. And then you've got the primary line, which is the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is becoming increasingly vulnerable. And I would argue that if the Ukrainians wanted to take that out today, they could, but they're waiting for more military capacity. And when you do that, Crimea goes from being a launch pad for Russian assaults to simply the most vulnerable part of the Russian landmass. And that's a different sort of complex. This summer is going to get really interesting. Will the Ukrainians be able to pull this off? Don't know. Everyone like me who saw this war coming, we all made predictions about how this was going to go, and we were all wrong. And then we got new data and we reassessed, and we were all wrong again. I'm just trying to highlight where we're seeing things move and where that might take us. The winter is going to be awful. It doesn't matter really what happens at this point. It's just a question of how much worse does it get. The Russians have basically taken something called the Fab 1500, dusted it off from their Cold War storage, put a Chinese-made flight kit on it and have glide bombed it in and simply destroyed entire power plants. The Fab 1500 has roughly a metric ton of explosives in it, and it has a blast radius in excess of 3/4 of a kilometer. So you're not talking about sending an Iranian drone into a small transformer station, something that can be repaired in a few hours. You're talking about leaving a crater in the ground where a power generation asset used to be, and that's basically the entirety of southern and eastern Ukraine now. There simply is not enough power. The only way that communities that are kind of east of Kiev and southeast of Kiev are going to have electricity this summer is if it's imported from the European Union. So it's a question now of transmission. Now, luckily, transmission is cheaper to put up than new generation, but yes, it's going to be a cold winter for all concerned. The Russians, by my math, have now set 34 red lines that the West has tiptoed across and then boldly stepped across, with the most recent one being the use of Western military technology to directly strike Russian territory across from the Kharkiv border. This is one of those things where if you have a time machine and you could go back 6 months, you could say that, this line and this line and this line were all simply Russian propaganda intended to make the West self-deter. Maybe we could have moved more aggressively. I understand why so many people want us to move more aggressively. The problem is we only have to be wrong once. Doing this slowly bit where one country, for example, the Brits sending the Storm Shadows, tiptoe across the line before everyone else gets in, I fully support that strategy. We will never get it perfectly right, but the consequences for getting it wrong are horrendous. As for the Azov Battalion specifically, this is a group that is, if they were headquartered anywhere in the Western world, most of their leadership would probably be in prison. But when you talk about neo-Nazi propaganda and fascist ideology, we're now in a situation where the strongest, most aggressive, most hateful fascists in the world are in the Kremlin, and that blurs the lines, for better or for worse. I'm pretty good at what I do, and I predicted that the war would begin in 2022 back in 2010. I don't have access to the information that is necessary to say that this will work in terms of calling the Russians on a bluff, and this won't. I'm not going to second guess the people who are in that position. I just say that I understand the caution, and I think it's prudent. We've also seen the Ukrainians go after a radar system that's deep within Russia, a couple hundred kilometers, that was designed primarily for ballistic missile defense. So you're talking about a strategic asset, but it also serves a purpose of detecting aircraft 1,000 kilometers away. So everything is now game, and the better that the Ukrainians can break up that system so it's not a unified network, the easier it will be then for them to achieve that all-important local superiority in aircraft. The Russians had 8 million men in their 20s, or at least that's what they started the war with. If they've lost 500,000 now, and 1 million have fled, that still leaves them with 6.5 million bodies to throw at this problem. And to be perfectly blunt, the Russians have yet to fully mobilize. Most of the people that they've brought in through their draft system have been minorities from ethnically disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged areas. They haven't really gotten into the core of what the country is capable of. That's still ahead of us. But at this rate, there's no way the Russians can keep this up for another 8 years. And I know that sounds like a long time. It is. This is the most dynamic military conflict we have seen in the world since at least the Crimean conflict in the 1800s, because we're dealing with a technological evolution here that is playing against a massive legacy. So you've got the Soviet legacy, which is the largest armament supply system in the world, and more importantly, the largest armament reserve in the world. That's a lot of hardware to chew through and a lot of inertia when it comes to innovation. On the other side, you've got the information technology revolution that has now, the second generation of it is being married to military affairs, and that's where all the drones are coming from. So we've got a technological revolution happening in very real time with a lot of outside support on both sides in pushing that technological frontier forward. At the same time, there's just this sheer mass of material that has to be blown up. I don't know how this is going to go, and people are coming up with new tactics every few weeks.